Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video in the Engaging with Art series. So, like choices and tools, this video is the start of a multi-part look at color. Color obviously is a choice or tool that artists will employ, but I felt that there was just so much to actually speak on and discuss, so many different facets of color, that I wanted to likewise make this multi-part and explore different aspects of color in art, and not just try to put everything into one video, essentially. I find color incredibly important to my practice, and so that's another reason why I have a lot of ideas I'd like to share. Now, I do want to stress that my approach is largely informed by my practice and my inspiration, and limited study, so I am by no means an expert. So again, as always, this is yet another speculative sort of approach to the topic. Now, this video is specifically discussing symbolism and how it relates to color, and I would like to start with some preemptive caution. Overarching associations of color as symbolic across art history can become very faulty. There was something that I learned in a class one time in undergraduate studies that mentioned that color tends to fluctuate. The symbolism that we associate with color fluctuates from period to period and across all eras. And my favorite example is in reference to the Blessed Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ is depicted in art. If we go back to the Renaissance, we will find that the Blessed Mother is typically drawn, painted in blues, whereas Christ is usually seen in hues of pink. And obviously those colors we would now associate with male and female, where the baby blue would be male, the pink would be female, but back in that period, it was opposite. If we were to try and take the symbolism of that color at that period and apply it to today, it would very, very quickly become a problem. So that's just one example. Context becomes incredibly important then, because we want to make sure we are taking into consideration what publicly held notions there are of the symbolic nature of specific colors for a time period. Again, to compare how a piece was using a hue symbolically 100 years ago as one would do with the same hue today becomes very problematic, again, because of how history changes the cultural norms and the perceptions surrounding that symbolic association. The biggest takeaway I think here is just to remember that associating specific symbolism with specific colors is very, very finicky. With that in mind, I like to think of it as a piece-by-piece approach. Historical context is important, but I think it should just serve as a small starter. Try to familiarize yourself with the commonly held notions of what colors are symbolic for that time period, but search within the piece self. Go a bit deeper and consider that piece in conjunction with a larger body of work or a series from which it's taken. And you may again find certain colors are being utilized in a certain way, kind of on their own accord, right? So within the microcosm of that body of work. But then go even smaller. Focus as much as you can on the piece itself, allowing the content of that particular piece to inform your thoughts on the possible associations the artist is making with the colors they are choosing, essentially, and what symbolic meaning those may have. As I keep reiterating, just be very careful and don't assume when it comes to symbolism and color, and try your best to start with each piece very specifically in its own bubble. Of course, artists are going to use colors as symbols, and one thing we can do is consider the artist's other work. Perhaps the artist is building on an overarching set of symbolism in a body of work or all of their work. Artists will make these associations of their own accord, so that just means divorced entirely even from the historical context of the preconceived notions of what colors are symbolic in what sense. And I think that's especially true today. Because symbolism is often referential, some works may use physical symbols that color heightens, so find those relationships. It's also very important to remember that color is not always symbolic, and often not at all. There's a great emotional capacity to color, and sometimes color is going to be used for the sake of representationalism. So if an artist is trying to depict something realistically, that artist is likely going to choose the colors that will then heighten that sense, which I think that's very easy to understand, right? If an artist is doing a landscape painting, for example, that artist is going to choose green for the grass, is going to choose browns and earth tones for any mountains or rocky landforms. And in that case, it's not necessarily symbolic, but it's quite literally trying to fashion objects as they appear in real life. Returning to the idea of physical objects being depicted in colors to heighten their symbolic ability, one example could be a clock. If an artist is trying to depict sort of the slow passage of time, maybe we depict blue as a color that has sort of a cooling sensation, so there's a slowness to it. So if an artist were to depict a slow clock, that artist may choose to use hues of blue in order to heighten the symbolism that the artist is already trying to associate by way of the clock in and of itself. Hopefully that's a good idea of how tiered and how complex this can get when we're looking on a piece-by-piece basis, because again, that's the important thing here. For my work specifically, I find color is highly emotional. Certainly there are moments when I will be using it more symbolically, and then certainly there will be moments where I will use it representationally, though I think to the least degree. For me, the large bulk of it is using color as emotional. So if somebody were trying to read my art as how those colors are symbolic for my time, it would probably find that viewer very lacking. They would at least find the work to be lacking or unreadable or confusing, because the virtue of my work is that the color is actually more emotional than it is symbolic or representational. That said, there are moments where I do employ it in order to facilitate some symbolism. For example, in my series 21st Century Royalty, I specifically am looking more into violets to make that association that was often held years and years ago about purple being sort of a royal color. And of course, we have royal purple as a hue itself. And so wanting to establish and help establish that in some of those iterations in that body of work, I am employing purple for that purpose. But this is again on a case-by-case basis. And interestingly enough, the reason I mention the historical context is only partially relevant is, in my case, I'm making these pieces in the 21st century. I'm utilizing that association between purple and royalty because it was once held years ago. So I want my viewers to sort of be taken back to that period by way of that association. And yet the association doesn't really stand for today. Again, it gets kind of technical, it gets kind of complex, but I hope you can see where symbolism with specific colors can really become tricky if you're not careful. Now, putting this all together and focusing back on you as the viewer, where is this relevant and what can you do? Well, as I keep stressing, the biggest thing is to avoid preconceived notions, especially regarding historical context. There are a myriad of examples throughout history we could point to, and that in and of itself is enough to tell you that the associations human beings have made between color and what they represent symbolically has shifted so much over time. Likewise, as the viewer, one thing to really be careful of are your own associations. It can really be a boon on first glance if you are coming with the baggage of already making those symbolic associations. Just like emotions, we have to be careful that our initial reactions aren't keeping us from actually sitting with the work. And kind of the same thing with symbolism, right? We don't want to just assume that our natural ideas of what colors symbolize what should be held as we continue to be with the work and try to understand it. As I said earlier in the video, always start fresh with each piece. Sure, you can look at the other work the artist has made. You can look at the other work in a series or body of work, which that's probably going to be the most fruitful for you. And yes, you can consider the historical context, but I really think it's most important to consider each piece of its own accord. Start with the content within that piece, and then gradually build your way outward when it comes to symbolic associations between the colors that you see and the actual piece itself and the ideas and everything swirling around it. And this video isn't to completely eschew symbolism in color, but it's important to remember that symbolism is concrete, and it's often a tool that an artist is going to use to further the emotional or conceptual intent of a particular work. Use that to inform your approach. Symbolism should be a doorway into a deeper understanding of the piece, because again, if we're using colors symbolically, or trying to form symbolic associations with color in a piece, it means we're doing so deliberately in order to help the viewer reach a specific point, emotionally or conceptually at some level. I think I'll wrap things up there for today. Thank you for taking the time to watch, and please share with anybody else who might find it worthwhile. Take care, everybody.